Hello everybody, this is Dr. DrCole, and I'm going to talk to you today about Chapter 1 in our textbook, Business Ethics, Decision Making for Personal Integrity and Social Responsibility. So the chapter begins with some questions about why is ethics important for the business environment, what's the difference between legal and ethical responsibilities, and how can we distinguish personal integrity from social responsibility. We're going to be talking about these questions for the whole semester, and this chapter gives us an introduction and an overview of some of those questions and some examples to think about going forward. So the chapter also begins with a decision point, a story about the Zika virus and the Olympics, and asks questions about the responsibility of corporations who are sponsoring the Olympics. Did they have responsibility for the health outcomes of the participants, of the spectators? And when there's a lack of agreement among experts, how does that affect our moral judgments? So it's important to think about business and ethics together. And maybe 30 or 40 years ago, this was a harder case to make. Why is ethics relevant to the business environment? But in the past 20 years, 15 years, we've had a series of problems and challenges in business that have impacted our entire society. And we see that the root cause of some of those catastrophes like the Enron meltdown, the economic crash of 2008, the BP disaster in the Gulf, the oil spill in 2010, all of those were impacted by ethical decisions of people in those companies. And so we keep seeing time and time again that the moral values and the standards and principles that a company follows has a big impact not only on the company but on the rest of us as well. However, going back a few hundred years in economic debates around regulation and competition and the free market, Adam Smith made an argument that self-interest was an important factor in our business environment, and in fact, self-interest fuels competition and it fuels economic growth. Some folks have read Adam Smith as if he meant that only self-interest is important and self-interest is enough. However, he was also an advocate of developing personal attributes and characteristics like sympathy and benevolence, and he also emphasized the importance of our social relationships and our connections to the community. And certainly Adam Smith is in favor of self-interest as a motivating force in the economy and in our personal lives. And he tended to believe that if everyone followed their own self-interests in a free market situation, then there would be an invisible hand, a mechanism in the economy and in society that would promote the best for everybody. However, he also insisted that there are certain conditions that have to be in place for all that to work. And so Adam Smith was imagining a pretty small scale market. He wasn't a big fan of large corporations or mega corporations. So he was imagining a small scale market with local business people, entrepreneurs, community members, and also he was a strong advocate of the importance of character. And so personal self-interest was not the only value or virtue in play. So we see that in a lot of ethical challenges in the business world, companies are trying to follow the law, but they don't live up to their ethical obligations to society and to consumers and to other stakeholders in society. So what's the problem here? Well, we see that sometimes following the law is simply not enough. It's difficult for the law to keep up sometimes, especially with the development of new technologies. And so Successful businesses tend to be built on a strong ethical foundation that goes above and beyond the law. There's a quote from page 7 in our textbook that says, beyond specific legal obligations, organizational survival relies upon ethical decisions in a great many ways. Unethical behavior not only creates legal risks for a business, it creates financial and marketing risks as well. So this leads us to consideration of the stakeholder theory, and this framework was introduced 30 or 40 years ago in business studies and scholarship. And the premise here is that the top decision makers in the business should consider the interests of anyone who is involved in making the decisions, but also who is impacted by the decisions. And those people are stakeholders. So that's stakeholder theory. So stakeholder theory tells us that we should take into account the interests and the needs of not only our stockholders, the owners of the company, but also employees, customers, the local community, the natural environment, other businesses that our company is doing business with or in relation with as well. They're all stakeholders, and their interests need to be considered. This doesn't mean that everyone's interests are considered equally or are treated as equal, but they are given proper consideration. An example from the book is Whole Foods Market, which has been a very successful business that's built on certain ethical values and principles, and it's given them advantages over their competitors, and they've been able to expand to a nationwide grocery chain. They have very high customer loyalty and employee morale. They've avoided major scandals, and they use this reputation to increase their business and their market. So ethics, taking a step back, we've been talking about business ethics and why is ethics relevant to the business context. But what do we mean by ethics? So ethics is a question of how should we live? And going back to some of the ancient philosophers in ancient Greece, ancient China, many of these great thinkers have had a big impact on how we approach ethical questions today. Socrates is one example. He's a model of ethical thinking, and he lived about 2,600 years ago, 2,500 years ago, and he was the teacher of Plato, and he believed that it is never right to harm another, and he was dedicated to philosophical questioning. He believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. So that illustrates for him the importance of questioning, asking questions. Why are we doing what we're doing? Is it right? Is it good? So the book talks about the difference between descriptive versus normative ethics. Descriptive is simply a empirical description based on observations of how people are guiding their behavior. So what standards are they using to guide their behavior? Normative ethics is practiced by philosophers, and it asks questions about how should we live? So what's the best way to live? So not just descriptive or scientific, but normative ethics is the focus of our course. There's a quote from page 12 in our textbook about ethical business leadership. It says that ethical business leadership is precisely the skill to create the circumstances within which good people are able to do good and bad people are prevented from doing bad. So this question, how should we live, this ethical question, involves a couple of different dimensions at least. One of them is the personal dimension, so the question of our personal integrity. How do we make moral decisions? What kind of person should I be? How should I act? What should I do? And then the question of social ethics. How should we live together? Because most of us are not living out in the wilderness by ourselves. We're actually living together in community and society and neighborhoods, families. So how should we live together? And how should our institutions be structured? Our government. This brings up questions of law, justice, public policy, and organizational structure. So this dimension, the social ethics dimension, leads us to decision making for social responsibility. So remember the subtitle of our textbook, decision making for personal integrity and for social responsibility. So those two dimensions we're going to be talking about in more depth and detail as we go through the semester. So business decision making combines these two dimensions: personal integrity, social responsibility. We can also think about the distinction between norms, values, and ethical values. So norms are guidelines for appropriate behavior. They could be workplace guidelines. They could be within a certain game context, for example. Values are beliefs and standards that guide our actions. And values could be unethical. So we could believe that it's appropriate to steal from other people. So if I'm a thief and I believe that stealing serves my self-interest and that's how I live in the world, that's a value and belief that's guiding my action. But we wouldn't call that ethical because, as the authors of our text point out, the ideal of ethical values is to serve certain core values, and that includes human well-being, freedom, justice, and happiness. So that's their definition, the authors of our textbook. That's how they define ethical values. So including in that collection of values and that definition of ethical values, Hartman, Desjardins, and MacDonald include this notion of human well-being and the impartial promotion of well-being for all. So obviously that value is extending beyond what we talked about earlier, the idea of personal self-interest. So freedom, not just for the individual; well-being, not just for the individual; health, not just for the individual, but also for people in my community. So how can we act to promote those values for as many people as possible? So one of the questions in the book is compliance with the law the only ethical responsibility of business? And in classic business ethics, going back 30, 40, 50 years, oftentimes that was the dominant perspective, that the responsibility of a business is to comply with the law, follow the law, and in doing that, it's fulfilling its social responsibility. But it also may push the envelope and work around the edges and in the gray areas of what is legal in order to maximize profits. That's the compliance model of business ethics, that the goal is simply to comply with the law. However, the law is not always efficient and effective at promoting social goods and individual goods, and the law cannot anticipate every challenge and dilemma that people in the business environment are going to encounter. And sometimes the law is just simply unclear and it's ambiguous. So it also raises the question that I mentioned earlier about the distinction between what is legal and what is ethical, and that's a distinction we're going to work on this entire semester. So part of what you're reading in Chapter 1 is the MBA oath that was developed a few years ago, and also there's a short reading which is a critique, an argument against the MBA oath. So I want you to think about for this this week, think about the MBA oath and the standards that it contains as a model for guiding a business ethically, and also take into account Theo Vermeulen's argument against the MBA oath. What is his argument? Why does he believe there's certain problems with the MBA oath? What are they? And do you find his argument persuasive? Why or why not? So also looking for yourself at the MBA oath, would you add anything? Would you change anything? Would you subtract anything? What do you think of the MBA oath? So that's what I have for you this week about Chapter 1 in our Business Ethics textbook. As always, post your questions online. We have a discussion forum devoted to questions about the reading, and let me know if you have any other questions about the course. All right, take care.